Good afternoon, everybody. This is David Marsh from OMFIF. I'm gathered together here with three experts on the history and the development and indeed on the future of economic and monetary union in Europe. We're here to talk about how the ECB and the EMU has progressed since the European Central Bank was set up in 1998, with the single currency coming a year later. What the challenges have been and how well the ECB is living up to the challenges during the COVID crisis, and what is needed for the future to turn the monetary union into something genuinely sustainable. We've heard a lot lately, including from the German finance minister, about how the euro needs to become stronger and needs to underpin European sovereignty. To discuss all this and to say their names in the order in which I will ask them to speak, I'm extremely happy to have three veterans of the European scene. Gertrude Gurel, who is a former deputy governor of the Austrian National Bank and was a member of the ECB executive board for 8 years, between 2003 and 2011. So mostly before the financial crisis, but a bit during the crisis. Secondly, we have Giuliano Amato, who is one of the grand old men of European politics, twice a prime minister for Italy, including in the time more than 25 years ago when Britain was for a short time in the European exchange rate mechanism, which was the forerunner of economic and monetary union. But he's also served as Minister of Interior in Romano Prodi's government, and he's been now a constitutional court judge in Italy for 7 years, so a position of great responsibility in Rome, and a man who really has his finger on the political as well as financial pulse. And then thirdly, Ottmar Issing, who combines German academic and bureaucratic experience with European experience at the European Central Bank like no other person. Ottmar, who was plucked out of comparative obscurity at Würzburg University to become the chief economist at the Bundesbank. That was in the leading up to economic and monetary union. And then when the ECB was set up in 1998, he became the board member for economics and was effectively the chief economist of the ECB for the first 8 years. The powers that be decided that it should be a person from the Bundesbank, a person with independence and a person with a sound academic record. And he was for the first 8 years up until therefore 2006, the head of the economics section and the board member for economics at the ECB. He's been the very great power in the land since then, also as the president of the Center for Financial Studies in Frankfurt. So Gertrude, I'm going to start off with you. The ECB and the EMU were set up with great expectations. It was going to be a pioneer to knock back the strength of the dollar. It was going to forge political union in Europe. It was to make sure that there would be constant growth and make sure also that the euro area would be free of worries about fluctuation against the dollar. How well has it lived up to this very, very large number of expectations that were vested in monetary union 22 years ago?
Yeah, thank you, David, and it's a pleasure hearing you all. I think the main achievement is macroeconomic stabilization, fighting crisis together. Because compared to expectations, growth has been lower, but let's look at the circumstances 22 years ago. Monetary union started when the bursting of the dot-com bubble hit the global economy. Interest rates were low and fiscal expansion prevailed. And the creation of the common money market in Euro led to an expansion of banks' balance sheets, and they doubled their balance sheets within 10 years. Some countries did not adjust their fundamentals to the requirements of the currency union, and therefore the crisis of 2008 was a burden. It was a burden to fiscal positions. It led to restrictive measures. Re-regulation of banks had a certain pro-cyclical effect, and monetary policy stepped in to balance the situation. And only after the establishment of the ESM, the banking union, the resolution fund, the resolution board, growth enhancing measures like the Juncker plan had a positive impact. And during that period, only a few years ago, the union was on a positive track again. But now, a few years after, the COVID crisis is an enormous setback. It is an asymmetric shock, and its fallout is not fully visible yet. It is now key to getting back confidence, to increase economic activity, higher employment and also to promote innovation, because it's a deep crisis where we cannot see all the dimensions yet. On other aspects, so this was on economic growth. Yeah? We had high expectations, but under the circumstances, I think rebalances was achieved. On the exchange rate fluctuations were eliminated between the trading partners, and this had a very positive impact on the single market. And on the single market itself, I think it's not completed yet, but it is on its way. And we have certain policy areas like competition, trade policy, capital markets union, energy, climate policy, which are important. And there has further work to be done. And the role of the euro as an international currency is stable at the moment. It was already higher before the financial crisis. But the euro is an important global payments currency. It is a reserve currency. It has further potential as a currency of issuance for loan provisions, and then therefore capital market union is a very important project for the union as a whole, apart from speaking with one voice, etc. So what if I draw a balance over the last 20 years, I think macroeconomic stability and also price stability, as far as it could be achieved under the circumstances, was achieved overall a very, I think, a confident result. And during the past 2 decades, on political union, maybe a last remark, during the past 2 decades, governments have come closer to each other, despite the temporary difficulties to find common solutions. And political union is not in the cards for now, in the historical definition, but close cooperation between neighbors and extending the space for common decision-making is already, I think, a lot. It has high value, and I think it's also accepted by the people in Europe.
Well, thank you for those very balanced remarks, Gertrude. It seems from what you're saying that you'd probably give the project so far something like 7 marks out of 10, something like that. That's what yes. I imagine that you are saying. Giuliano, as I said before, you are very much a veteran of all this. You had talks with President Mitterrand about what Mitterrand had in mind. Do you think we are going towards political union as a result of this latest great crisis? And what marks out of 10 would you give the project so far in the 22 years that EMU has been in existence?
I was telling you, David, that I still remember the words of the leaders that decided the euro at the end of the Maastricht conference. I wasn't there at the time. I was out of government. A few months later, I arrived as prime minister, but I did not take part in the negotiations of Maastricht. But of course, the peak was deciding the euro. And the main question for the non-economists was the relationship between the euro and political union. You remember that before the conference, initially, the leaders had decided to hold an intergovernmental conference for the monetary union and perhaps a second one for political union. Eventually, they decided to join the two adventures, but actually, it was more a conference on monetary union than on political union. So the euro made sense for several of us as the symbol embodying a political union that was arriving. After all, the currency expresses in itself the main bulk of sovereignty besides declaring wars to others. Helmut Kohl said, no, we have not arrived at political union, but the euro has made it unavoidable. I still remember this adjective, unavoidable. Others said the same thing. I remember my Italian treasury minister, who was at the time Guido Carli, you remember, the former governor of the Bank of Italy, used exactly the same word. It will make it unavoidable. Now we know it has not arrived, political union. I mean, what has happened afterward is that the euro has made it necessary, but not unavoidable. And this is part of the problem we have today. Do I conclude that therefore the euro has been a failure because it has made political union necessary but not unavoidable? Not at all. Not at all. I am well aware that the integration process is is a long process with stops and go, stop and go. First of all, the achievements, stability, as she has said, much more stability despite the crisis of what we would have had without the euro and still having our different currencies, even though linked to each other in the European monetary system. I was prime minister in 92, 93, when almost every day the markets could decide to enter into any small distance between one of our currencies and the other ones, and creating the conditions of a sort of earthquake inside.
Yes, the markets were sovereign then, weren't they? The markets had sovereignty.
Remember September 1992, the lira and the pound flying happily in the skies, whatever the interest rate of our central banks, and later on France by the end of the month also. So much more stability. This has to be recognized by anybody. Second, I can't forget it, because in the 90s I was heading the Italian Antitrust Authority. Well, in terms of completing the common market, it was an essential tool. So it had been initially presented by the Delors Commission's report. It was presented not as a transfer of sovereignty from the member states to the European community at the time, but as the last obstacle against the level playing field that the integrated market was supposed to be. Any other barrier had been removed, tariffs, customs, differences in technical rules for products, etc. The only remaining instrument, tool in the hands of the states was distorting the conditions of competition by changing the value of their own currency. I will know it because I am an Italian. And I well know that Italian industry frequently created better conditions of competition for our own products.
Yes, we all remember there was a regular bout of devaluation. Julian, could I just stop you just for one moment, just to ask you one simple question before then going on to Otmar Issing, because I think just going back to your point about political union, as you say, it is necessary. It is not inevitable. Is it now much more difficult, even though it may now be necessary? Because one of the problems, as I think your present governor, Ignazio Visco, said a few months ago, basically the countries don't trust each other. That he put that as one of the big problems. Would you agree with Ignazio Visco that there is a lack of trust?
I understand this point, but I'm convinced, paradoxically, that now we have better conditions not for completing the process of political integration, but for making further steps, as the recovery fund somehow is. Don't forget this point, that this union that seemed completely disrupted due to the pressure of populist nationalist movements has succeeded in creating a common financial tool based also on a common debt to face a common difficulty of the member states. This is doing exactly what was missing when the euro was created. Some sort of economic and fiscal tool at the supranational level balancing monetary policy.
Good. Well, thank you for putting that point. That is absolutely essential. This brings us to Otmar Issing, because it is quite clear that a currency does need such a tool. Now, Otmar, for many years you have been saying that a political union is maybe a necessary instrument, but you've also been warning very strongly, including quite recently, against bringing in political union, quotes, through the back door, end quotes, throughout without a proper legitimacy, without the proper democratization. Otmar, in your view, is the recovery fund, which we're now putting into place, is that such a backdoor instrument? Will that lack, therefore, the accountability, the democracy and the transparency that a genuine political union does need?
I would like to start with a short comment on the recovery fund. I think the recovery fund, first of all, we have to recognize that this is a break of a taboo, that the EU takes up so much credit, which was not foreseen. And I think it would be an illusion to think that it's the last time, because the next great challenge, global warming, is already waiting. So if for the COVID crisis, the EU is allowed to take huge credit, the next case, which is even more important for mankind, global warming, is around the corner. So I think how this the spending on the money which is provided by the recovery fund, I think is a real test. If countries really deliver on their commitments and are not spending money on pensions or whatsoever, on social benefits, but only for investment into the future, environment, innovation, research, etc. But I would like to take up the point Giuliano Amato was making, because this is key, but I will bring it to the prospect for the future. It's true, in '92, Helmut Kohl in the Bundestag explained it would be absurd to create a monetary union without political union. And he was convinced. And this was a conviction also of the Bundesbank, of majority of German economists, that political union should come first, at least contemporaneous with monetary union. But after 1992, in the direction of political union, nothing happened, as we know. And it was not the fault of the German side. There were other countries which were not the slightest.
Shall we say France, for example?
Yeah, so it is true. I wanted to be not nationality pointing, so I said some countries. It was in first place France. Very clear, very clear. So the idea was, starting with monetary union without political union is setting the cart before the horse. Now we discuss a very different approach. Now the case of political union is discussed under the headline, we need political union to make the euro a sustainable currency. This is totally different. If one would design a political union, I think how would one start? One would say we need a foreign common European policy, we need a common defense policy, and then etc. Now it's the other way around. The need for a political union because a currency without a state might not be sustainable. So this is a very different approach, very different approach. And David, as you mentioned, I'm always concerned that there is not a really transparent and open discussion. Who is in favor of a political union should be transparent, should make a project, should bring this project to the voters, to the people, and we should have a referenda. In Germany, we would need change of the constitution, and then the people of Europe, as their representatives in government, would go in the direction of a political union, but not through the back door of taking credit of doing this and that, like the Juncker method, saying Juncker has once mentioned. And this, I think, is for me a deadly blow to believe in the integration. He, as commissioner, president of the commission, he said, no, it was before, but he has confirmed his view. I call it the Juncker method. Juncker said, we take decisions, and if there's no uproar, because people don't understand what we have decided, we go forward. This is the Juncker method, and if you extend it to fiscal policy, etc., this is a way to try to avoid the confrontation with the voters and to establish things which cannot be changed anymore. Not least because the European Court of Justice now is in favor of everything what the court thinks is pro-European.
Well, so far you might say so good, because in fact there has been also in Germany no huge outcry, has there, at the moment? But we'll come on to that in a moment. I just want to ask Gertrude, we'll talk about the future in a moment. Gertrude, just one point from you, please, because you are from Austria, which is also one of the countries which has been relatively well aligned with Germany. There's some people, particularly in Germany, who feel that the ECB has not fulfilled its original characteristics. It's been entering too much into quantitative easing. It's moving into an area which some people may be feeling is quite close to monetary financing of the state. Do you share those views that the ECB is, if you like, sailing a little bit too close to the wind?
I'm not talking about if quantitative easing was too much or too little. This is not my point. One can always discuss to what extent the degree of monetary stimulus is okay or not. But in my mind, the ECB has transgressed the limit, the frontier to monetary financing already in 2010, when it bought selectively bonds of countries, which is very different from the quantitative easing, in which the ECB buys proportional to the equity. And I also think that...
Sorry to interrupt, but let's hear from Gertrude now. Gertrude, what is your answer to that question then, please? Thank you.
I would say we should distinguish the period before COVID and after. Before COVID, I would say there was a widely held view that monetary policy should go back to normal. That means having interest rates higher in the future. I would say we should distinguish the period before COVID and now. before COVID, I would say in general in Austria, there was a widely held view that monetary policy has done its job during the crisis and should, as soon as possible, normalize. That means terminate the provision of ample liquidity, phase out quantitative easing, and as soon as possible also raise interest rates. During the crisis, these crisis measures, these measures taken at the beginning of this year, I think they were widely accepted. But there is the view, I think, that fiscal policy has to play a stabilization role. It cannot be everything done by the ECB. No.
So in a way, there's a useful balance there. I've got a question from the audience, actually, which I'm going to put to Giuliano Amato. It's absolutely tied into something that Otmar has been saying. This is a question from Ian Begg from the London School of Economics. I'm going to put it to you, Giuliano. Now, when you ask experts whether this borrowing facility will be permanent, that is the recovery fund, the experts that Ian has been speaking to lately, they say it will be a Hamiltonian moment, it will be permanent. Do you agree with those experts who say that we've now crossed a Rubicon, basically, with this recovery fund? The European Union will now have a permanent borrowing facility, and this could be thought of as of a similar importance as the Rubicon that Alexander Hamilton crossed in 1790.
A similarity between this situation after COVID and the Hamiltonian idea of the common debt does exist, perhaps for the first time in the history of the European Union, because I remember when the Italians and others were asking for a common debt to repay part of national debts. The Eurobonds conceived in relation to national debts. Any quotation of Hamilton was not appropriate at all in relation to national debts, because at the time the common debt was possible and Virginia was convinced that it was possible because there was a common debt of the former colonies due to a common cause, the War of Independence. Now, this has not been for us a war of independence, but certainly we had to fight a sort of common enemy. And our economies are now resenting for the injuries that we owe to that common enemy. So the door now is open for this kind of tool. Can we imagine this tool as a permanent kind of device that will remain for the future European Union? I would say that I hope so, because this is exactly the reason due to which we have had up to now quantitative easing that is a very artificial and too unilateral way of keeping interest rates low and allowing some of our economies and public finances to survive. But it can't work forever. In times of COVID, it's like keeping people under intensive care forever. They don't breathe normally under intensive care. After the necessary time under intensive care, you need other resources for them to breathe. You need the real economy to be funded by other means, a fiscal and economic policy at the European level. Let me finish by reminding all of us of the fact that also in federal states, like the States, when a member state has a huge and not sustainable debt, it is its own responsibility to repay for its own debt. The federal level intervenes by grants going directly to the economy to allow the GDP of that state to grow and to create the resources to repay also the debt. This is what the Recovery Fund somehow reminds me of. And this is something that I like for the future, because, let me say also this, I don't agree with the decision of the Bundesverfassungsgericht. I don't think that a national court like theirs, like mine, can decide above the European Court of Justice what the Court of Justice has said. But the problem is real. You might disagree with their decisions, but they have put on the table a real problem. It can't last forever. You have to do something.
That's a very good point, and you've set up a whole series of different questions now for Ottmar, Giuliano. Well, firstly, you've described the Recovery Fund as a kind of balancing mechanism to help sort out some of the discrepancies in GDP. You said you think it is a Hamiltonian movement. You also said, quite revealingly, that you felt that the ECB quantitative easing was not about trying to get inflation up. You said it's all about trying to keep interest rates down. Would you agree, first of all, Ottmar Issing, with that characteristic of quantitative easing as it being up to now a means of simply lowering borrowing costs for countries like Italy that otherwise would face rather high borrowing costs? And then secondly, could you tell us whether you think this borrowing facility will become permanent?
On the last point, I'm afraid it will. I'm afraid because once you have transgressed the Rubicon like Julius Caesar back in Roman history, there was no way back. And I think this is what will happen. And I'm afraid that this happening will deliver arguments for right-wing parties. I think this is an important issue. The more the EU concept goes away from the present system, which is enshrined in the Treaty on the European Union, the more leftist, right-wing, extreme parties will take argument from them, and voters will partly join them. So this is my.
Sorry to interrupt on this point, Ottmar, but shouldn't you, as somebody who is actually in the middle of these different people and somebody who knows a lot about it, shouldn't you be intervening to say, don't worry, we're going to make sure that this will be all right? Don't be afraid, but this is the right way forward. Shouldn't you be saying that?
This is a bit too simple, David. This is a bit too simple. But what was your first question?
Well, the first question was whether what Giuliano said that in fact the ECB quantitative easing is all about trying to keep down borrowing costs for countries like Italy, and it can't go on like that. You've got to turn it into something permanent. I thought the quantitative easing was all about trying to get inflation up. I thought that was what the mandate was all about. But I must have been wrong there.
It hasn't worked in this direction so far, and I think the ECB should just accept that for the time being there's no shortcut to bring inflation back to, let's say, target 2% or so, and this is not a big problem. What is the problem? It's price stability. People like that, but the quantitative easing with the increasing amount transgressed into the direction which is having selective consequences for different countries. And one should not forget when President Lagarde said it's not the task of the ECB to reduce the spread on interest rates for different countries. I was asked what my comment would be, and I said, this is exactly what the ECB is for, and it's not for. But I said I don't want to be quoted because it might undermine Lagarde's position if she
I remember
supported
you saying
me.
that, but of
But
course,
afterwards it turned out that it was rebuked. So what does it mean? What does it mean? Is an official line now that quantitative easing is also a tool to reduce the spread between long-term interest rates, which would be clearly a violation of the principle of monetary financing.
yeah, I mean, I remember that very well, Otmar, because of course it wasn't just anybody who said he didn't like that idea. It was President Macron who told Madame Lagarde that in fact she was wrong there, and in fact she did change her mind, didn't she, quite quickly after that. I'd like to go back to both Gertrude and Giuliano on this point about the right-wing politicians. We just heard Otmar saying that this new setup could potentially undermine credibility in monetary union. Now, Gertrude, starting off with you and then Giuliano, are there really right-wing politicians, for example, in Austria, who could somehow rebel against the new formats that we have for monetary union? As Otmar says, we seem to have got away from some of the purity of the forefathers of monetary union. Is this a real problem that there could be some political backlash against some of these greater powers that the ECB is now taking on? Gertrude, first of all you, and then we'll go to Giuliano.
I would say that populism is always a threat. We have to be very careful really to explain economic policy, and because the more stress we have in the system, and don't forget we have a huge crisis, many people are losing their jobs, we will have an increase in bankruptcies, we are heading for a difficult time in Europe and elsewhere as well. So this is usually a time where people are turning to extreme positions. I don't see at the moment, despite the fact we have sometimes a smaller right-wing, at the moment, smaller right-wing party calling for anti-European policies. I would say the majority is still behind European policies. Of course, it is important to have a framework which could last for the future. And the recovery fund was conceived as a one-time fund. It cannot be prolonged without the consent of governments. So it is under the control of governments what happens in the future to the EU budget and the EU financial means. I mean, if countries are ready to increase their contribution to the EU budget or restructure the EU budget, then we don't need a recovery fund in the future. And therefore, I think it was an important step in this difficult period to get an agreement on the medium-term budget in the EU. And we have also in the past had some funds which were allocated between those who were contributing and those who were receiving them, like Central and Eastern European countries received more than they paid into the system. So we had this kind of redistribution effect in the past, but it's important to keep the people behind what you are doing at the European level.
Okay, well, let's go on to Giuliano, because of course you have also national politicians in Italy, some of whom are calling from time to time for Italy to leave the euro, and that's one of the reasons why interest rates on government debt have been relatively high. What can you do about these right-wing politicians and national politicians in Italy? What is the right way to counter these views? There'll be a microphone again, please.
Okay. First of all, just in a second, let me say that when I was referring to quantitative easing as a huge tool to bring interest rates down, I had the original Mario Draghi's theory about this kind of tool. That is, my goal is price stability. Price stability implies that having interest rates heavily diverging from my objective, which is below 2%, I have to intervene to bring these diverging interests down, because otherwise they are not connected to my goal. And this
Okay,
was
well, that's a good explanation. We understand that.
the Court of Justice. Quantitative easing, initially OMT, were accepted as part of monetary policy. I have remained there, and I defend also in legal terms this kind of position. Going to the other topic that you are now proposing, I would say that there were some economists playing a political role in the Northern League in Italy, advocating the walking out of the euro. I would say nowadays that I can't see this as a relevant position inside even the Northern League itself. Probably the leadership of the party has perceived that this position is so dangerous for several reasons that is also counterproductive in terms of political consensus. And therefore, it has remained somehow hidden somewhere inside the party, which has not formally abandoned it, but it is very quiet. Personally, I can't see a future for that specific position. The point that I consider important, essential for all those like me who support a further process of political integration is that if we think that on the one side, more competencies should be done and should be given to the European level, more resources should be given, Gertrude was saying, to the European budget so that tomorrow a special fund might not be needed anymore. On the other side, it is equally necessary to give national states all the space that might be compatible with an efficient European Union.
Because subsidiarity.
Under these populist positions, there is the actual need of a role recognized to national identities, of mutual recognition to be used more than uniform regulations whenever this is possible. The directives leave a real space to national adaptations depending on situations. Those who want to build a more integrated Europe have to have also this in mind. Otherwise, the tide of the populist might become stronger again.
Okay, well, thank you. That's a very important clarification. I've got two questions now for you, Otmar. Also, I'm getting quite a number of questions from the audience. If anybody would like to put a question, please do send one in via the chat button. Two questions for you now, Otmar. And we heard just now about how Giuliano Amato believes the tide of populism is dying down a bit in Italy. Though in your country, in Germany, there is still a lot of opposition to the PEPP, and the AfD, the party, the opposition party, the far right, has actually launched a lawsuit against PEPP. First question to you, Otmar, do you actually see a reasonable time frame for the ECB to exit from the PEPP, for instance, next summer? That's the first question for you.
It's obvious. I think the ECB has entered a slippery slope, and it has continued quantitative easing at a time when the employment rate in Europe was high, unemployment was low, and Draghi's last poison gift to the ECB was the decision to extend quantitative easing at a time when there was no economic indication to do so. This was before COVID. Anybody an idea that COVID would come? I'm not criticizing the reaction on the COVID crisis situation. This is very, very different. So getting out now, markets are, for me, the ECB is prisoner of fiscal policies and financial markets. Whatever the ECB will now do, the time for going to normal is certainly not yet come. This is very clear for me. But when the time comes, an increase in interest rates, even the ending of quantitative easing would put markets to a real test, and fiscal policies in countries. So getting out of this situation, exiting from this abnormal situation, will be extremely difficult. And
but do you think there's a chance it could happen next summer with the PEPP if all goes reasonably well?
Yeah, and ECB now has also explained that it feels also responsible for climate change, fighting against climate change. So what does it mean? They are buying green bonds, preferably. And if they would decide we should reduce quantitative easing, if they sell green bonds, you can imagine what critique will be put on the ECB. They are, so to say, contributing to global warming, etc. I think this kind of politicization of monetary policy is a very dangerous development. And we should not forget, an independent and central bank is made independent to deliver on a limited goal. It's given by the legislators, given by the people, by voters, and central bankers are not responsible to voters. They are responsible to deliver on their limited mandate. And what goes beyond is, for me, not democratically legitimate.
Well, thank you. I've got a second question for you. I'll come back to you in a moment. We've got 10 minutes left, so I'm going to put just one question about the future now to everybody. And I've also got a question for Otmar. First of all, Gertrude, we've spoken quite a lot about leadership, because that does have a reflection on political opinion. In Austria, you have now this young chancellor, charismatic, dynamic chancellor, Mr. Kunz. Is he the right person, do you think, who can explain to the Austrian people that overall monetary union is, quotes, a good thing, end quotes, and they may have to accept some elements of a transfer union in order to make monetary union work properly? Do you have the right leadership in Austria? Yes.
I think it works now. I think the current government has a clear opinion on Europe, I think, where maybe there are differences is integration policy, migration policy, but on economic policy, I think there is no hesitation about Europe. You know that our government took the position of limiting the volume of the recovery fund and limiting the volume of grants.
And getting a rebate as well.
Yeah, apart from that, I think there is a clear pro-European stance, and if there is any initiative on, say, discussing the future institutional setup in the union, I think he would be on board for that.
And Giuliano, you're basically saying that the Northern League, they have quietened down on the idea of leaving. Nobody in their right mind would want to do that. And you're linking that partly because there's now been more acceptance in Germany that there will have to be some transfers. If, on the other hand, we were to go back to a situation in Germany where you had a finance minister who was maybe more aggressive than Mr. Scholz is there a danger that we would actually see this reversion of the situation in Italy? And then the second point, do you see, after Mr. Conte steps down eventually, do you see the need for a prime minister who will be somehow more of a unifying force and can bring the country together in the direction of much needed reforms, which is something that people always say are necessary in Italy?
Well, let me say that when you have this dissatisfaction, which is sometimes hostility vis-à-vis Europe, of our so-called populist parties, sometimes this is due to the fact that the Union, the others, are doing too much of something we should do on our own. Some other times, the complaint is the opposite, is not doing enough, is not doing enough. The ideal would be a recovery fund that is at our disposal. We can do whatever we want with these resources, and no one else, nowhere in the world, can tell us what to do with it. Now, this is quite unilateral, I would say, but I'm sure that here a common understanding would be reached also with our Italian populists, who were against the tough conditions that were set with Greece years ago at the times of austerity, but cannot reasonably reject conditions on the use of a common debt to solve also your problems. But don't forget that sometimes they complain because Europe is doing too much, some other time because Europe is not doing enough. It was not doing enough, not giving us resources. The resources are arriving. Now there will be a little bit of discussion on what can be asked to Italy for the use of the recovery fund. Don't ask me what I expect for the future after Conte, because my first answer could be, as a judge of the Constitutional Court, I can't express myself on domestic politics, which is true. Should I forget my role, my political answer would be, I have no idea at all.
Just one last question to you, Giuliano, before the last word goes on. Right, is saying, do you think Mario Draghi will make a comeback as a senior Italian politician to steer Italy through to the future?
Well, you know, I have written recently a preface to a book on Draghi, and I can repeat what I wrote in the final words of this preface. Mario doesn't like politics as a job for himself, because he is not ready to accept the kind of bounds, of limits, of constraints that an ordinary politician has to accept. If I have to lose money because I lose votes, if I don't use that money in that way, this is something that cannot be asked to him.
Well, thank you for not straying into Italian politics. Thank you for doing that. Otmar's got 3 minutes now to answer two questions.
Having said so, and I conclude,
yes.
Should a terrible situation come out of the events of the future months, should the country be in a condition similar to the condition of 2011, etc., how can you say no to your country calling?
We'll watch this space. We'll watch this space. We've got two questions for you right at the very end. One is a caller wants to know about the target 2 balances. Is the fact that target 2 balances have now gone above 1 trillion, is that a reason why Germany is becoming more open towards fiscal union, because in a way you're there already? And then secondly, a very good question from Marek Mora, the deputy central bank governor from the Czech Republic. Will the euro become a smaller entity where you don't actually need political union? because that would be one way of getting over this problem, to have the European Monetary Union made up of just Luxembourg, Germany, Austria, and the Netherlands, and so on. So those two questions for you, Otmar, to end up.
On target, the problem is it's a problem once a country will leave. But the more these balances accumulate, the more difficult separation would be to handle. So it's also a kind of ransom, so to say.
So ransom is like, yes, okay. And the second question, will the euro simply become smaller, because then you don't actually need a political union?
I tend to respond like Giuliano Amato. I think at the moment nobody knows. I would expect the euro area will expand. If this is good, this is another question.
Well, okay. Well, you can have Scotland if you like, because Scotland may well wish to join at some stage in the future. I'd like to draw this to a close now, because we've come to 5 o'clock in Giuliano Amato's Italy, where you've got to attend another meeting. It's been a fascinating encounter from 3 very wise veterans who've seen a great deal of the political and economic ups and downs of Europe. We've recorded all this, so we will be sending this out in a lightly edited video. I think we've had some major revelations here and some very important opportunities to look at the future. Giuliano Amato, Gertrud Tumpel-Gugerell, and Otmar Issing, thank you very much indeed for your time. This is David Marsh signing off from our fascinating look at Europe's past, present, and future. Thank you all very much for being with us today, and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.